start. Thank you. Thank you, Sharon, very much indeed. So welcome. Hopefully you had a pleasant break last week, and that you managed to spend a bit of time, I suppose, going a bit deeper into some of the activities or the readings or the databases or whatever you might have done. So thank you to those of you who have sent in your assignments for assignment 1 for your reports on the interviews. That's making some very interesting reading, and it looks like you've really sort of come to grips with the task really well. I know we've got a number of extensions, so there's another batch coming through at this weekend, so hopefully those of you will get that organised as well. So that's all great. So what we're doing now is moving on into, I suppose, more obvious areas of legal research, moving away from the background discussions into getting your hands really dirty with different aspects of legal research. And so tonight we're going to start Module 3 and investigate some legislation. The scope of the evening is that we'll spend some time looking at the different acts, the structure and feature of legislation, so that you, I suppose, understand what it's all about. We'll consider some different types of acts and a little bit around sort of the journey that legal researchers, or you're understanding the journey that legislation takes from its inception through to being repealed. So there'll be quite a few different bits of terminology to get your head around. Next week we'll sort of spend a bit of time on delegated or subordinate legislation. So really it is about acts, bills and acts this week. After the break, I'm going to hand over to Sharon, and she's going to take you on another little bit of a journey along the path of bills through to legislation and help you understand it from probably some different perspectives as well. So there's not just one way to skin a cat. There's lots of different approaches, and so we'll introduce you to a few different ways while we go through it. So legislation is obviously an important part of society that is governed in some way by the authorities. So we regard it as being the main source of legal rules, and arguably very few legal problems can be answered without reference to legislation. So it really is critical that you feel comfortable in that sort of area of laws, of acts and all of the rest. And it's really important that you can find both current legislation, but as we've mentioned in the past, you may need to identify legislation at a certain point in time because of the incident that is being investigated through the legal research process there. But what's interesting to note is the amount of legislation that is produced. There are new acts which come through each year, and the subordinate legislation, so the regulations and orders and things like that. There are also amendment acts. So not every piece of legislation is a new act. There are very often, and probably the majority of acts these days, are actually amending other acts, and they may just amend one single act, or it may be a fairly complex piece of legislation which amends multiple acts within the same amendment act. So looking at some figures there, yes, from the Queensland perspective, that's where we are. If you're in a different state, you might like to do a bit of research yourself to see what the process looks like in your own parliament. Queensland has averaged about 65 acts per year, and that's new legislation and amending acts. And this year we're tracking at the moment as around 54 acts. The majority of them have been amending acts, I must say. The Commonwealth, however, has generally averaged around 147 acts every year. So last year it was 41 new acts, a total of 177. But if you look at this year, we're actually a lot lower, only 68 acts and only 11 new acts. And I think this reflects the challenges facing basically what is pretty much a hung parliament. It's really very difficult for the current government to get the legal principles it would like to see in legislation through the House and definitely through the Senate. So that just shows very drastically the drop of the amount of work that's happening in the Parliament at the moment. So I found that just a little bit interesting. A couple of tools that you really should know about and would encourage you to investigate in as much detail as possible. These are free to air. This is the Australian government. It used to be called ComLaw. It's changed in recent months and is now called the Federal Register of Legislation. As you can see on that screen there, it's the blue squares or rectangles provide you with the different types of legislative materials that you need to know about. So there are acts in force, there are legislative instruments in force, then there's an area of notifiable instruments in force, bills as introduced, and then the gazettes and some general information. So today we're really going to mainly go into that first pale blue area of acts in force. But I encourage you to go and explore and become familiar with it as you progress and develop your skills. So this is a screenshot here, and I apologise that it's quite small, but if you've got, the PowerPoint is available for you on the website, so you could print them out big, A4 size if that's what you want to do. But basically, it's a quick snapshot of the acts, and you can see at the bottom in the in the actual URL, it says this is by year the acts in force in 2016. So these are the new acts that have come through. So none of these are amending acts, these are actually new acts. The top ones, Appropriation Act, Supply Act, they all relate to ensuring funding going through the government. So they're sort of fairly administrative in nature. And then there's just a handful of other ones there. The Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility Act, Australian Crime Commission, National Policing Information Charges Act, etc., etc. So that just shows you what has been going through the Parliament at the moment in terms of principal acts. This screen is then acts as passed. So it's important to note that every act, as it is completed its journey as a bill and is made into a law and ultimately goes onto the statute book, it's referred to as an act as passed, and they're given sequential numbers. So this screen just shows you the Act number 1, Act number 2 for this year, so sequentially going through. And so you can see there that the top ones, they're pretty much a lot of amending acts rather than the new pieces of legislation going through. And so that's just important to note. Whereas if I just go back to the other screen, you can see that the top one is, if you can read it, Act number 27, and the next one 29, 36, 37, 38, 41, etc. So the new acts are scattered through the whole parliamentary listing of what comes out. So if we look at legislation as a source of law, as we sort of discussed earlier in the program, states have wide power to pass legislation for themselves, and if you go into the Constitution Act, for example, this one's for Queensland, the purpose of legislation is for the peace, welfare and good government of Queensland, and that's in Section 2 of the Constitution Act 1867. So the states are subject to the limitations as set out in the Commonwealth Constitution. So there's a bit of a pecking order in terms of what is the remit of the Australian Parliament compared to the states. And so basically all areas of society these days are sort of subject to legislation in some form or other. And I think we tend to be accepting of the fact. If you look at the newspaper, then lots and lots of stories are relating to the legislation that is relevant in different contexts. So it looks after government activity, looks after our business, consumer affairs. We've got the family law, everything that relates to family activities. environmental protection, and if something goes wrong, obviously the legislation is really important. The criminal code, so all of that area. And then as society deals with new issues, new laws may be introduced. And we'll sort of look at an example of that on the way through. And so just, you could use this for any jurisdiction. You could just drop in to your state area of legislation where that's published and have a look. I've just chosen totally randomly C, the letter C for Queensland Acts. And so this is in the website for Queensland legislation. So each state will have its own. Again, before we go further, you can just see along the blue tabs at the top, you've got current legislation. So there's the acts in force, acts as passed, so that numerical sequence of acts. Then SL, so subordinate legislation as made, bills, repealed legislation, information and purchase, so some other activities along there. So again, as you go down, you've got the same sort of options available just to click through from each area, depending what aspect of legislation you're trying to locate. So here's a screenshot of the letter C for the legislation that goes through. And if you just have a quick look there, you can see that the state legislation covers a very wide range of different topics, different areas of our lives. So there's a Casino Agreement Act for Cairns, there's a Heritage Act relating to Cape York Peninsula, there's Carers Recognition Act, a bit further down, Cattle Stealing Prevention Act going back to 1853, then some to do with business, Central Queensland Coal Associates Agreement, Central Queensland University Act. I think we mentioned before that the universities have their own areas of legislation. So very, very diverse areas that are covered with those. So increasingly legislation plays a role in our lives, and as a result of that there's quite a lot of people involved in the industry, if you want to see it that way. So obviously we have lawyers who are very busy in working in that field, but police obviously have to make sure that either people are abiding by the law or they are arresting people who break the law, etc. Through the courts, you've got all of the judges and the whole infrastructure of the courts. Public servants are involved, of course, through a lot of areas like subordinate legislation especially, etc. And then statutory authorities also look after certain areas of legislative activities. So the Australian Tax Office, ASIO, the ACCC, ASIC, all of those organisations are involved in ensuring that the different individuals and businesses abide by the different laws that are available and are relevant. But at the same time, we also see legislation as a reflection of our values. And that's where new topics come. I won't read all of this through, but it's around society, so major issues perhaps to do with, at the current time, euthanasia, so that the ability to choose the way you die, at what time. Abortion laws come into play. And then in the example at the bottom there is the Civil Partnership Act of 2011. That was passed in December 2011, but then the new government came in and their values were different. They didn't like the terminology of civil partnership, so they actually had an amendment act to make it into the Relationships Act, so changing the terminology, the actual language that is in relation to civil unions, etc. So it's quite interesting just to monitor what's happening in society that way. Over the years, there's been a lot of focus on improving legislation as a document. If you go back to some of the much older acts, you will find them quite difficult. The language is complex, the syntax is complex, whereas in recent years, specifically through the Law Reform Commissions and the Attorney General, there's been big steps to improve with providing much clearer directions about the legislation, on how it works, including step-by-step guides or flow charts. The explanatory notes are important, and a real push for plain English writing. So it's trying to make it much more accessible to the general public to be able to understand all of these things. And I think earlier on in the program we mentioned the Interpretation Acts. You need to be aware of those because they are also useful to help you understand how to interpret, literally, the legislation that's before you. There's certain common denominators which flow through those. So in terms of the life cycle, again, we went through this earlier in the program. So you've got the bill that gets passed in Parliament, it receives assent, it gets that running number of the statute, number such and such of whichever year it is. There'll be some commencement provisions. There may be ultimately some amendments sooner or later. Sometimes it's really quite soon, as we saw with the piece of legislation that was actually amended in its title within a few months. And then reprints and compilations are when many amendments are in place. It's a way to make sure that the piece of legislation, the act in force, is presented as it is at the current time. So we'll look at some of those as we go through as well. And then at the end of the life of an act, there will be a repeal. So not all legislation has ongoing purpose. Society changes, life changes, and so some acts are repealed rather than just being continually amended. So that's important to note as well. So there again, that's your the screenshot for the Queensland legislation page, and that's the federal one. So again, go back and explore your state and also the Commonwealth one there. There's quite an interesting document which came out of the Parliamentary Council in Western Australia, and they've actually got a lovely document which is How to Read Legislation, a Beginner's Guide. So if you are new to this field, go and sort of download that or read it online to have a look at some of the advice that they provide. It's certainly not a piece of legislation, a law or an act, is not like picking up a novel and beginning at the beginning and working through to the end. You do need to understand the structure and where you're likely to find the information that is going to be what you are looking for. So you need to first get that sort of general overview. If it's a new piece of legislation that you're not familiar with, there may be a preamble or a purpose. There's generally almost like a simplified outline of the Act, if that's provided. But they have pretty good tables of contents and headings that you're able to follow. There are definition sections and schedules which are also very helpful to help you understand the different aspects of the law. So you're going to use some of those navigation tools almost to help you locate the relevant provisions for a research topic, your legal research topic. And of course pieces of legislation can vary in length. They can be just 1 or 2 pages, really very short if it's a simple matter, extending right the way through to really, if you look at the Income Tax Act, for example, or that is really quite voluminous, very, very many provisions trying to cover all aspects of income tax, etc. So different levels of complexity. So become familiar with those that you need to. So this just gives you an overview of the different parts of an act. There's a title, of course, as we've learned, to how to cite it, how to refer to it. And we've looked at the difference between a short title, which is how we know it generally, but then a more detailed long title. So those are obviously very important aspects to make sure that you're using or working with the relevant piece of legislation. Then the Act number we've talked about as being an identifier, and that's very helpful when you need to find an Act as passed to go back to that. There's a table of contents, maybe a preamble, the date of assent, some words about the enactment of it and the commencement provisions, the definitions, there may be these days some objects or purpose clauses, and you'll find that there are different headings, there might be some margin notes or footnotes, and then of course it's divided into sections and subsections of the Act itself in terms of the content, and at the end you'll find some schedules which might provide further, almost like appendices with extra details as required. So just to have a quick look at one act here, the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank Act of 2015, and that's a Commonwealth Act. And that just tells you, that's what you would be looking at. You've got the coat of arms at the top, then you've got the short title, the Act as passed, so it was Act number 134 of 2015, and then you've got the long title, and it is an act relating to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and for related purposes. And it's a fairly short act, it's just over 5 pages, and so you can see it's fairly quite simple there. It's got the different sections, the short title, commencement, simplified outline, etc., etc. So that provides you with a quick navigation tool to find out what you might be looking for in a small act. And then after that it goes into the main text, and that is the layout of the act. You see this, it's very clean, lots of white space, making it much more easy to find your way around. So as a second example, I thought I would look at this Relationships Act 2011. That's what we had last year, and so I thought, okay, let's just see what's happening in this whole legislation field. I mentioned before that it had changed from the Civil Partnerships Act to the Relationships Act. And so if you're looking at here an example for Queensland, if you look at the current list of acts in force and you look at Relationships Act, it actually refers you back to, see, Civil Partnerships Act 2011. And then if you so you need to sort of be able to sort of jump forwards and backwards in various ways. If you then look at the Civil Partnerships Act as an act in force, it says previously the Relationships Act 2011 and previously the Civil Partnerships Act 2011. So the current name of the act is also the past name of the act, which I found quite intriguing as to what's been going on in the time between us running the course last year and running the course this year. So here's your act. This tells you that this is the Civil Partnerships Act 2011 for the state of Queensland, and it tells you the level of currency. It is current as of the 22nd of March 2016. And that shows you the beginning of the act. And from there, the end notes, okay, we haven't really mentioned the end notes. At the very end of the act, the end notes provide you with a lot of the information you do need for legal research processes. And so this tells you the list of legislation. It gives you the first act, the Civil Partnerships Act of 2011, that was number 46, and it gives you the date of assent and the date of commencement, etc., etc. And then as you work through it, there's an Amendment Act. I thought I had put some red rings around some of these. Yes, there we go. The next slide. So the first red ring around it shows you the Amendment Act for 2012, but then there's also another Amendment Act for 2015. And if you look at the third red ring, it shows you the short title. Section 1 is the short title, and that's been amended in 2012 and in 2015. So the name of the Act itself has actually changed twice, which is really quite unusual. This shows you the acts as passed, so we've now gone back to each act. We know that the Civil Partnerships Act for 2012, if I go back to here, it shows that it was Act number 12 of 2012 in the first red ring there. So you need to be able to navigate that. So that takes you there, so you can hyperlink straight into that piece of legislation. And should you move forward with that, the amending clause is there in Section 4 of the Amending Act. It wants to amend the short title, going from civil partnerships. It says omit that, and then insert relationships. So this is the evidence, if you like, that the name of the Act has been changed, the authority to change the name of the Act. And so if you wanted to, you could go to look at to find more information about how did it happen, why did it happen. You might want to go back to the bill and the explanatory memoranda, the explanatory notes, which will give you background information about what's been going on in the development of the legislation. So the screenshot for the bills being introduced into Parliament, they are collated by the Parliament itself, so between the elections. So you can see there, it's not terribly clear, but the dates. So there's the 53rd Parliament, the 54th Parliament, and the 55th Parliament. And so it was a Labour government in Queensland in the 53rd Parliament, and that was between 2009 and February 2012. Then the new government came into power, and that was Liberal National, and so that covered the period 2012 to 2015. That government was overturned at the elections in 2015, and we went back to a Labour government. And so you can actually see the alignment of the title of the Act going with those different government parties. So the wording was civil partnerships under Labour, it changed relationships under Liberal National, and then it's gone back to civil partnerships. So it's, yeah, quite intriguing the way it's all come to pass. So under that, you could go to the bill for the 2012 one, and you've got the link straight through to the text of the bill. The next column with a little sort of icon of a document, that's the explanatory notes. So you can click on that to get more information about the background to a bill. The text of the bill will be the clauses as adopted and then becoming the law itself as the Act. So this shows you the explanatory notes, the objectives of the bill, and point number D is to change the title, the short title of the Act to Relationships Act, and then to change lots of the terminology flowing through the Act as well. So that would give you the background as to what was going on. And so that shows you could go back then, if you really wanted to go back further to the other bill, the 2011 bill, and look at those explanatory notes, you could do that as well. And that would provide the original bill much more detail about the objectives of the bill, what it was seeking to achieve, and what the legislation would cover. So that's just, yeah, that's where all of those changes went to. Looking at the 2015 amendment, okay, so we know that the short title has been changed back again. So you could look at the changes in the annotations there to say, okay, the short title changed 2012, we looked at that, but 2015 is Act number 33 of 2015 and Section 5. So that would take you directly to this little screenshot here, which shows you that relationships in the short title should be omitted, and you should insert civil partnerships. So that's really sort of how you're able to track what is happening. So it's a lot of detective work, and it makes really a lot of interest in terms of finding your way through that piece of legislation. In the explanatory notes to the Amendment Bill for 2015, it does show that it's, again, this is where they want to rename Relationships Act to Civil Partnerships Act and make other terminology changing back again. So, quite a story. Another really interesting act is the succession to the Crown Act. I won't go into a lot of detail. You can possibly follow through in the slides in your own time. But this Act of 2013, which looked like that as an Act has passed, that's number 22 of 2013. And then there's the current legislation. It hasn't changed. That's as it is still today. So the last is 2014, 15th of May. So this is the Act in force. And basically this relates to, you may remember there were changes to English law relating to succession to the Crown to move it away from just male heirs becoming king to actually allowing the female offspring of the reigning monarch to become the next reigning monarch themselves. And so this is the Act. But because of our relationship and we are still part of the British Commonwealth, the legislation had to be passed in all the territories relating to being subjects of the Queen. So this is the Queensland Act, but it's all closely related to a number of different acts. This just gives you, I thought it was interesting for you to see, the Succession to the Crown Act 2013 is the short title, but look at the length of the long title. It's quite a complex one. So to change the law relating to succession to the Crown, to validate certain marriages being void by the Royal Marriages Act 1772, so really going back, to repeal that act, etc., etc. So a lot of detail in that long title there as to what it's about. And there's a preamble, so this gives you the, I suppose, the historical information that you need to understand as to why it is relevant. And then this gives you the actual act itself as to what was happening and the different sections which are relating to succession of the Crown not dependent on gender and the different marriages. So being no longer, Roman Catholic is no longer a reason not to allow somebody to become king or queen, etc. So in the schedule at the end, it gives a little bit more detail. And this is then related, you see, to Succession to the Crown Act at the Commonwealth level. So the states are here rather subservient. So the Queensland one actually had to sit on the statute books waiting for the Australian Act to come into force as well. So, and then all of the states and territories, that's actually from Wikipedia, was the easiest source to find about all of this. But it all goes back to all of the states at different dates, really waiting until the Commonwealth Act was in force. So it's just an interesting example of how some pieces of legislation are interlinked across the different states. The proclamation, so that's when actually the Commonwealth Act came into force. It interestingly had to wait until a certain time in the UK. So while we tend to believe that we're totally independent from Britain, there are areas where the linkages through the Queen are still very strong and there. And then just as another example of a piece of legislation which is quite different, the Emblems of Queensland Act 2005. And that shows you the being current as at 2030. But sometimes they make errors. Sometimes there are typo errors, and they produce a revision, a revised version could come out. You might see that sometimes. But I thought what was interesting here, the Emblems of Queensland, obviously it's about the flag and the state, the coat of arms and things like that. But this is where the schedule is interesting to see what goes into a schedule of a piece of legislation. And so this is from the schedule, this is Schedule 1, so it actually has the graphic design of the monochrome pictorial description of the coat of arms. It's there, sort of, that's the official place where you would refer to what does the coat of arms look like. It's actually enshrined in legislation in the Emblems of Queensland Act. So that's interesting. Schedule 4 tells you what the other state emblems are. They sound like trivia questions, but there's the floral emblem is the Cooktown orchid, the faunal emblem is the koala, etc., etc. And so importantly for this piece of legislation, it was that they'd never had an aquatic emblem before. So point 5 in the schedule shows that the aquatic emblem is the barrier reef anemone fish. So this was new. So this was the actual piece of legislation which allowed that emblem to become part of Queensland. The explanatory notes tells you the story. It gives you that there hasn't been an aquatic emblem, and this needs to be introduced. So, at the same time, there's some repeal provisions, and this is a new act. It's not an amendment act, but this new act actually repeals an earlier act, which is the Badge, Arms, Floral and Other Emblems of Queensland Act from 1959. So this shows you the provisions in this act which enables that earlier act to be repealed and taken off the statute book. And so this gives you the date of assent and that it commenced on the date of assent. So that's another thing you need to be aware of. When is the act assented to, but when does it actually come into force? When does the legislation commence? Sorry, just hold on a minute, please. Sorry, I just had somebody walk into the room and I had to change things. So here again, looking at the screen for Queensland, you'll see that there's a link through to repealed legislation. So if you wanted to double check, well, you know, that act shows, the previous act, the Emblems of Queensland Act, shows that that piece of legislation has been repealed. You could go into the repealed legislation area to double check. We knew it was called the badges, etc., etc. So under letter B, you get the list of all the different legislation that has been repealed, and underneath it tells you the reprint series. So as amendments are made to pieces of legislation, they may be reprinted to draw all the amendments into a single narrative for the legislation. In the old days, there was a lot of activity called noting up. You had to literally cut up pieces of legislation and stick it onto the older act to show where the amendments had been made, etc., etc. Digitally produced legislation obviously is much easier to insert the amendments, change the text, and then reprint it as well. So you'll see that the badge, arms, and floral emblems, etc., that had a reprint, one reprint, so number 1, 01, and then some slight further amendments, 01A. The Banana Industry Protection Act was a bit more complex and went through sort of 01A, 01B, 01C, etc. So those are things that you need to be aware of about how the legislation might be changing over time. Then there are sort of a number of different types of acts. We won't go into this in detail, but you need to be aware, as I say, the terminology. So the private acts, those relate to individual groups of organisations. So like the Queensland University of Technology Act, that would be an example of a private act, as opposed to a public act, which relates to members of the public, for society in general. And that they're supported then by the Interpretation Acts as well. The codes, that brings together both the common law and some statutory principles. So we talk about the Criminal Code and the Building Code of Australia. So where there's some commonality required, it might be put into a code. Consolidated acts bring together a number of separate pieces of legislation, and then might repeal older acts, as opposed to a reprinted act, which is just sort of like incorporating the changes as it goes through. Interestingly, the Consolidation Act does involve the repeal, whereas the reprinted act is just a more updated version of the act as it is in force. And the government printer can just do that progressively as required. It doesn't have to go through Parliament at all. And then compilations are sort of up-to-date copies of legislation that are available. And there's some readings for you. There's a few things about how to understand an Act of Parliament, how to read the legislation, and also law as culture, if you are interested in the way that law changes. The Australian Law Librarians Association in Queensland last year or earlier this year, I can't remember, earlier this year maybe, they had a book launch that I went along to as well, and it was a retired lawyer who was really interested in the cases, the court cases that had changed the law. So that's another way that legislation might get changed, where something goes through the courts, and then so really leading mainly criminal cases, which led to the introduction of new legislation in lots of ways. So that's another one to look out for. So do we have any questions? That covered a lot of fairly complex aspects and features of legislation. That's what I was trying to explain there. Do you have any questions at all that you'd like to discuss? It's all very quiet. Okay, so there's nothing but you. Has anybody looked at their state legislation websites yet? Have you begun to explore what you do have in your own state or territory? Claire's just coming up with something. I think she might be typing. Most days, she says. Okay, any features that are important? You've seen the Queensland one. Does the Queensland one look sort of simpler, or is it? Do you find them easy to navigate? Putting you on the spot here. Okay, just typing something at the moment, and you think the Queensland one is easier. Okay. So that's these days the way legal research often works is that you do need to become familiar with more than just your own state or territory. So it's a good opportunity. The Blackboard site you will find has got some quite useful resources for you. For New South Wales and for Commonwealth, Larissa, and she's going to join us again next week, on the Week 4 site page of the website, of the Blackboard site, Larissa has provided us with copies that you can look at, which are taken from her training resources. So there's one training handout for Commonwealth legislation, and there's another one for New South Wales legislation, because obviously she's responsible for New South Wales Law Courts Library. So you might like to look at those in your spare time as well to see and work through some of the guidance that she's able to provide. If you go back to week 2, we've provided a number of tables of legislation, or tables of legal resources, sorry, and it includes both legislation and case law, and it takes it from the perspective of the free-to-air, the sites, so like the legislation websites that are produced by the governments, but then also the subscription resources through the different databases, and which are useful for different purposes, and it covers legislation and case law. So I did note when I double-checked it before class that the Commonwealth one still referred to Com Law, so we'll get that corrected as soon as possible, and make sure that it links you through to the Federal Register of Legislation as opposed to the Com Law site. That's a fairly recent change, so we'll make sure that gets corrected. Okay. Well, you might like in the break to sort of just pop through and look at those. Also on the Blackboard site, there's a couple of videos, an introduction to legislation, if you haven't looked at that. There's also a QUT lib guide that you could explore as well on finding legislation. So those would be worthwhile looking at. Then as you progress down the Blackboard site after class, we do have a series of exercises for you. Activity 1 is based on understanding different elements of an act, so making you actually engage with a piece of legislation and find out a little bit more about it. Then there's a few questions around finding legislation on a subject. So we've offered you just taking you straight to pieces of legislation, but very often you need to find out which is the relevant legislation pertaining to a certain topic. So we've given you some exercises there for you to start exploring and looking at some of the different online tools that you can use to find out about some of those. And then there's an activity which is about updating an act. So from the acts that you find in activity 2, then there's a series of questions you can follow through on to make sure that you're aware of the current version of the piece of legislation and that it is in force, or it has been repealed, or whatever it might be. So to make you go through all of that. We've got some terminology which does relate to the Principal Act, Act as Passed, etc., etc., the reprint or compilation, all of those terminology that we want you to get your head around. So what we'd like you to do is to spend time on those during the week ahead, and in next week's class, Shuin will lead a bit of a debrief so that you can see where we don't want to mark your work as such, but it'll provide the guidance with sort of the steps to be taken, how we found out, how you might have found out about it, and different strategies that you can consider to be able to answer those type of queries. So as I say, they're not for marking, but they are for your learning to become familiar with the territory. So let's take a break for, what's it, 46 on my clock, so just about 10 minutes, come back